Hello everyone, my name is Jung Soo Kim. I'm the Academic Vice President for Delta Phi Epsilon.
Hello, my name is Kenneth Lee. I am the Editor-in-Chief for Glimpse from the Globe.
And today we are here in the beautiful SOS B2 during our Delta Phi Epsilon chapter times to talk about North Korea. We have up here a bunch of panelists who are going to handle different issues from the identification section, so they'll talk about what angle of the issue they're looking at, and then second half we'll talk about policy. They'll advocate or argue for certain policies that they think each country should do. So let's real quick introduce ourselves.
Hi everyone, my name is Crystal Yang. I'm a junior and I double major in International Relations and Law, History, and Culture.
Hello, I'm Rebecca Chang. I'm a junior studying International Relations.
Hi, I'm Sumin and my major is I'm majoring in International Relations and Global Economy.
Hello, my name is DJ. I major in Business and Accounting and I'm a junior.
Hello, my name is Jacob Lockshin. I am a senior studying International Relations and History.
Hi, I'm Francis Acevedo. I'm a freshman and I'm majoring in International Relations and the Global Economy.
Hi everyone, my name is Luke Phillips. I'm a senior studying International Relations.
Hi, I'm Yash. I'm a junior studying Economics and International Relations.
So our 8 panelists today are gathered to discuss the issue of North Korea. North Korea is a state boasting a population of 25 million people and is about the state of Indiana. Yet it's casting a much greater than life shadow upon the East Pacific and the Asia Pacific, with its nuclear weapons program, missiles program, and millions of forces on the 38th parallel. Most recently at the General Assembly for the United Nations, we saw President Trump call Kim Jong-un a rocket man, while Kim Jong-un's representative at the United Nations called Mr. Trump, President Trump, a dotard, a senile old man. Unfortunately, this conflict is not just rooted in words, it's rooted in weapons. Missiles on both sides, nuclear weapons on both sides, and a conventional military force that could create chaos in East Asia. We have gathered 8 panelists today to discuss first the identification of the issue. We'll cover each country topically and their policies and their stakes in this issue. Afterwards, we'll take some questions from the audience. And then in the second half, we'll discuss policy solutions and policy ideas to move forward. So to begin, we'll begin with a first sort of roadmap of the different topics we'll discuss on a topical basis. We'll start with a 30-second introduction from those who are going to speak in regards to the United States.
So to dramatically oversimplify, the United States has always had about 3 main policy imperatives when it comes to North Korea and the East Asian theater more broadly. First off, North Korea is not the interesting story in East Asia. It's always been China. China and the US ever since about the 1960s has been the main balanced power story that you're talking about. North Korea being a Chinese ally, that's been the primary lens that we started to view it in. The second lens is the normative lens. Can the North Koreans be allowed to have nuclear weapons? And that started to become an issue in the 1990s. And that brings into questions of international law that are partly related to geopolitics, partly related to security, partly related to international norms and proliferation. And then finally, there's the question of the security of the United States' ally commitments in the Pacific Rim with the South Koreans, the Japanese, the Filipinos, and various other nations along the rim of East Asia. So it's a lot more complicated than just do the North Koreans have nukes and what do we do about it? There are many, many strategic factors to play in the United States' view of the region.
Now we'll get a 30-second introduction on speaking on the Chinese policy in this region.
So the Chinese Communist Party's main concern is pretty much domestic stability, which means maintaining legitimacy and power of the regime and keeping the one-party system as strong as possible. Now, this means that it needs to extend to stability in the Asia-Pacific region and maintaining the status quo that it has been satisfied with for a very long time. When the status quo means that it keeps this economic relationship with North Korea, and this economic relationship is pretty much China is the only strong ally of North Korea, which means it's a leveraging tool. The second of the status quo is no regime collapse. And so China's stakes in this discussion is that China wants to maintain the status quo for many reasons. And so when China looks at the United States, China doesn't want US to push too hard, because if you push too hard, that means regime collapse. And if you push too little, that also might mean whatever you guys would like to consider. So China wants to pretty much maintain the status quo, but also not have what everybody else fears.
Thank you. Now we'll start with an introduction in regards to South Korea's role in this conflict.
Yeah, so as you know, the most influenced party because of this in this situation is the other Korea, South Korea. And unfortunately, South Korea doesn't have a united voice or stance on what we should do to deal with North Korean situation and nuclearization of North Korea. And I'm going to discuss various different views that South Korean people have right now regarding the issue.
All right, perfect. So now we're going to give each panelist 2 minutes maximum to elaborate more on what they'd like to discuss here. So let's start with Luke. Would you like to elaborate for a bit?
Yeah, certainly. So at a very, it's the thing that makes North Korea such a puzzling question for American policymakers is you run into trade-offs with whatever course of action you pursue. So the stated goal at various times in the history of the U.S. involvement in the region has been we want a democratic, unified, pro-American Korean peninsula, which would be an ideal situation in a lot of ways, but everybody's kind of acknowledged that the problem that you run into with that is, number one, that's going to create a war in which millions of Koreans on both sides are going to die, probably hundreds of thousands of Americans are going to die, and not least, you're going to run into a situation where you get into a conflict with China, which has huge interests in the stability of this area as well. On the other hand, the continued survival of the Kim regime and that regime's pursuit of nuclear weapons creates a weird situation where you start to open the Pandora's box of a second or third age of nuclear proliferation. If the North Koreans can have nuclear weapons, why can't the South Koreans and the Japanese and the Saudis have nuclear weapons as well to defend themselves from other states that are pursuing nuclear weapons? So it's not just a question of how do we keep the status quo going, because under the current situation of the status quo, there's a lot of things that could go wrong. On the other hand, pretty much any dramatic action and pretty much any decisive action to dramatically shift the situation on the Korean Peninsula, either in favor of the South Korean people or in favor of the American hegemony's interests, entails significant costs that are always the costs of things doing business internationally. But you have a kind of American foreign policy elite that prefers stability to this kind of dramatic action, and I think that's one of the reasons why we haven't seen much in the way of action on North Korea, for better or for worse, ever since the nuclear program became public in the mid-90s.
You know, I think it's pretty interesting that you bring up a lot of things about lenses and the American foreign policy perspective, Luke, because when you think about it from the Korean perspective, right, they've seen an America which has invaded Iraq, Afghanistan, taken extrajudicial action in Syria, and just recently increased our defense spending by about $80 billion. And meanwhile, we're wondering why this country would have any interest in building up a nuclear weapons or nuclear missile stockpile. So I challenge you to kind of think about what would a state in that position have to defend themselves, to use as a bargaining chip, or to use to negotiate in the future, because I think it's very easy to say the Americans are interested in democracy and stability, but meanwhile, we're still trading with the Saudis, we're still working with the Chinese government, which has committed many human rights abuses, and this may be a special situation, or it may not from a North Korean perspective.
Any other panelists want to jump in on Luke's
Or Yash's points?
or Yash? We'll take one question from the audience if you guys would like to jump in on this. Don't feel like you have to, but could you stand up and introduce yourself real quick?
Okay. I'm Sheridan Smith. I'm a senior. In regards to you talking about proliferation in the entire global sphere, we've seen issues in regards to policies such as SALT 1 and SALT 2, and that it not being effective policy. A couple of weeks back, last week, Rick Larson came and talked about creating defensive missile programs, defensive laser programs, all that kind of stuff. What do you think that the United States should do to defend its own domestic soil and also push non-proliferation abroad?
So the question from Sheridan Smith, a senior, is discussing defensive missile programs. She brought up the issue in the Cold War, the U.S. did defensive missile programs against the Soviet Union. whether or not those sort of similar missile defense programs should be implemented in the case of the North Korean threat.
Anyone want to jump in? Anyone could jump in.
Anyone can jump on it.
So, to oversimplify dramatically, the main reason why missile defense is not a bigger thing than it is, and there definitely is possibility for more capabilities in missile defense, but the main reason why you don't have more countries normalizing that, and the reason why when Reagan had the Star Wars missile defense program in the 1980s, and why that was a huge controversy back then, is because there are certain norms between nuclear missile owning states that, including the balance of terror, including mutually assured destruction, that suggests that if one party has missile defense and the other party does not have missile defense, then that alters the balance of power between them and would encourage, supposedly by the logic of nuclear theorists like Herman Kahn, it would encourage one party to do a preemptive strike and start a nuclear war because one of the parties was trying to build a defensive thing. Now, we've never seen that happen, and I hope we never see it happen. But I think it actually should be, as we consider proliferation prospects moving forward, I think a good way forward, if we're going to assume that various countries around the world that do not have nuclear weapons are going to acquire nuclear weapons, one of the things that we should be talking about as the international non-proliferation community should be, well, maybe we want to start expanding missile defense technology as well to kind of create a counter and a security against this kind of thing, so that to kind of allay the nerves of people who otherwise wouldn't be consoled by the fact that their neighbors now have nuclear weapons.
Any other thoughts real quick on that?
One follow-up on that issue right now. Actually, the United States is installing a missile defense system called THAAD, T-H-A-A-D, in Korea, South Korea. And that's being another hotly debated issue in South Korea as well, whether we agree with that or not. And and that's actually an ongoing process right now as we talk about it.
And the topic of missile defense will definitely come up in the second half when we discuss actual policy implementations, so look forward to that as well.
Are there any more comments from the American side before we move on to 2 minutes from each China analyst panel?
No, I'd love to hear what the Chinese analysts have to say.
All right.
Yes.
Crystal, could you start us off?
Okay, adding on to Rebecca's point before, besides the political interest, China also has some economic interest and its willingness and ambitions to create the international recognition of its policy. So speaking on to the economic impacts, recently in a summit with Chinese and European leaders, China actually coined a phrase called common fate organization, which means like China wants to have itself as a multinational cooperation center and then acquire more and more help from other nation states and try to create a more humanitarian basis organization that can address this issue, especially regarding to North Korea. China perceives itself as a problem solver or a major problem solver that can challenge the regime, that can put control and leverages on it. So it requires a lot of international recognition on Chinese leadership on this issue. So my point here, I guess, is try to say that besides the political issue, there are also a lot of image and perceptions that Chinese want to pursue in this kind of issues. And when we're talking about the missile defense especially, it's also really important to consider the relationship between China and Pakistan, who has been a major founder of the 30 nukes and also some kind of proliferation weapons to North Korea. So it's a regional issue, it's definitely a global issue too. What China should do, my personal opinion is it should try to cooperate with the United States, but also try to seek any political and economic sanctions on North Korea to make sure that it increase its political legitimacy, increase its control over the region, and increase the international the recognition from the international organization.
Perfect. Panelists want to jump in on that? Ask any questions or follow-up statements?
Yes, DJ.
An interesting brief that I can bring up is that not only Kim Jong-un condemned Trump for the statements that Trump made, but they also condemned China for trying to step into the issue very recently. And it's known to be the strongest accusation that North Korea has made to China ever. So so there's a shifting relationship between China and North Korea, and that is also an interesting perspective that we can take on this discussion.
We're going to move on to give our Russia analyst a little bit of time to talk. Then we'll finish off with South Korea. But
All right, guys. I'm just gonna start off real quick by doing the 30-second introduction thing.
We forgot to do that one.
It's okay, better late than never. So basically, what Russia wants in North Korea is, I guess, two main things. Number one, they want stability. They don't particularly want a nuclear war, which is understandable. And number two, they want to be involved in the process. They don't want this just to be a South Korea, China, North Korea thing. As you've seen across the world, Russia wants to be involved in things that are happening to show that they have some global clout and influence on events, especially these sort of hot button events. Like right now, actually, these news came out recently, like past day, that they are in extensive behind the door backroom, I guess that's the term, backroom discussions with North Korean diplomats and leaders, trying to figure out what the hell's happening with the current situation, trying to calm it down. So that they're constantly working to try to go about that. Obviously, they have long historical ties with North Korea. I mean, Russia, when it was the Soviet Union, was, for lack of a better term, sort of the creator of North Korea in a lot of ways. So they certainly have that relationship. Although in recent years, they've tapered off most of their involvement with them. They've mostly followed with general UN Security Council resolutions on North Korea and don't have as close ties as they used to. So they're not trying to be best friends with North Korea. I don't know if they particularly would say they even like North Korea, but they understand why they want nukes. I mean, it makes sense. They can relate to that. And they want them to be stable. They don't want regime change. In a lot of ways, they line up with a lot of the elements of what China wants in the region.
So would you go as far as to say that they want a buffer state against the U.S. presence in East Asia?
Yeah, I think to an extent that's certainly true. Not necessarily in the direct territorial buffer part, but certainly to have kind of an ecological partner in that region. Because obviously South Korea is such a strong U.S. ally that Russia's big on having these spheres of influence, and I don't even know if I would say North Korea is under their influence so much, but they like the idea at least of having someone that's not an antagonistic power towards them on their border.
Yeah, adding on to that, in some Russian cities like Vladivostok, actually, a lot of North Korean workers are sent over there and work and provide a lot of really cheap labor to the Russian economy. So that's another aspect of keeping the regime stable. So that's something more people could look at. Any questions from the audience on this? Lisa? Yes. Stand up, please introduce yourself again.
Hi, I'm Lisa Raffles. I'm a sophomore. And I guess this question applies both to Russia and China. But how much leverage would you say that those Russian backdoor deals, and how much leverage does China have over North Korea?
Okay, so Lisa's question, she's a sophomore at USC, is how much leverage does China and Russia wield, respectively, in North Korea? We'll start with Jacob.
All right. Yeah, I think they would like to have more than they do, which I think is true for most of the parties involved in North Korea. I think something that Russia and Putin has very acutely said this, that they understand why they're doing what they're doing, and they don't think that necessarily even the sanctions that they put in place, like Putin's remark that he doesn't necessarily think those are going to work, because he understands why he says as long as basically they have this security necessity for nuclear power, why would as he said, they can eat grass as long as they still have their security. So I don't think that he envisions himself having an enormous amount of power. I think his power or Russia's power wants to be constrained to just keeping North Korea stable and exerting power over the sort of coalition of powers around it to make sure that things don't get out of hand.
Yes.
China?
So I guess the most important resources that China has to give leverage on North Korea is basically energy and also basic materials such as coal, steel, and also oil and also other economic aid, since North Korea, after the UN General Assembly's sanctions, it doesn't really have any opportunities to develop its economy. Also, it's a really national-centric country that refused to engage in foreign trade with other countries. China is one of its major allies that would basically not giving any presumptions, not asking any benefit, but choose to support them economically. So that's definitely one of the important elements that China has to control on the North Korea. Another thing I would say is the political stability because, as I said, they're all under the communist regime. So recognition of North Korea is definitely like serve as an ideological like leverage tool on this country. I think Sumin might. Do you have anything to add on it?
Oh, I would also point out the underlying historical tie between China and North Korea, because after the end of the Cold War and the system change in the late 1980s, the North Korea lost its benefactors, which are the Soviet Union and China. And China especially significantly lost its influence on Korean Peninsula since North Korea trusted China a lot. And when the Chinese Minister of Foreign Policies visited the North Korea after China's alignment with North Korea, Kim Il-sung, who was the leader of the North Korea, didn't even welcome him. And this explicitly shows that China actually lost its leverage and its power on North Korea. So it's really hard to tell at this moment that China actually do have some leverage.
You know what's really interesting about your question, Lisa, is that North Korea is one of the most opaque political regimes in the world right now. So while we can talk about kind of what the Russians want to do and what leverage they have, or what the Chinese want to do and what leverage they have, the really interesting thing is we can see the inputs and we can see the outcomes, but it's kind of a black box in terms of the process, right? So we're not really sure what's working or what's not, and I think that's a really interesting element of this regime. And it's interesting to think about how that kind of disables us in terms of policy solutions, which we're going to talk about pretty soon, and how that kind of hampers our ability to understand what's going on in the regime, what do they care about, what really makes them tick.
Awesome. All right, so then we're going to finish off our identification with Sumin. You already kind of spoke a bit, but if you have any other words briefly to talk about.
In regards to South Korea?
Yep.
Oh, okay. So, continuing what I just said, so after the Chinese minister visited North Korea, North Korea actually realized that the system is changing back then. So they soon dropped out from the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, and then they started developing the nuclear weapons. So I personally agree with the Japanese international relations scholar called Hiraiwa Shunji, and he talked about that this alignment between South Korea and China actually motivated North Korea to establish a stronger national security in an anarchic system. Because as an autocracy and an intransigent state, which keeps getting threatened by other states and global institutions, North Korea really needed a strong weapon to survive and to communicate with great powers without being neglected.
Okay, thank you, Sumin. I think part of our discussion in South Korea also has to discuss parts of domestic politics in South Korea as well. So, DJ, would you mind discussing a little bit about South Korean domestic politics?
Okay, so judgments are up to you. I'm going to explain a couple different stances that exist in South Korea. So largely, we can divide the South Korean opinion in two separate aspects. One is a conservative approach, basically saying us, South Korea, and North Korea cannot coexist. One has to fall. And within that conservative approach, there are mostly three stances they have. One would be that we should pressure them through sanctions and along with our allies. So they really emphasize a soft power approach. And they want to cause an internal collapse of the regime. The second would be nuclearization of South Korea, right? Because they have nuke. We should have our American tactical nukes placed in South Korea so that we can retaliate once we are attacked, right? That's another branch of the conservative side. And another one might be a stance that are willing to risk a full-scale invasion and full-scale military actions, basically who are like willing to risk a war to take down the regime. And the liberal side also has a few branches into it. One would be, so they all start off with starting off with talks and giving humanitarian aids, and then they negotiate. And they have some differences in what they want to get out of the negotiations. Some want a complete truth between South Korea and North Korea and just exist as two neighbor states. Others want to basically reunite through negotiation process, or others basically want to just de-escalate the tension temporarily and see how it goes from there, maybe change the regime or not.
Okay, thank you, DJ. The politics of South Korea are definitely complex, and many people have many different opinions. Soomin Kim brought up a comic from a South Korean newspaper that she'll share to discuss the discourse in South Korea right now.
Yeah, so this is a cartoon about the current situation in the Korean Peninsula, and President Moon Jae-in of South Korea argued about South Korea being an active driver in dealing with issues that are going in Korean Peninsula. However, this cartoon illustrates the potential concerns that it might not be Korea as a driver. Instead, there are many other potential drivers, including President Trump, Abe of Japan, Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, and Putin. So this is a very illustrated cartoon that explains the current situation in Korean Peninsula at this point.
Interesting point.
And Jacob?
Yeah, just like one quick thing. So, I mean, obviously, Russia has not been as involved, especially in the THAAD debate, as China has. But more broadly, they're pretty much against U.S. missile defense placements, more or less anywhere. Basically, anywhere that they have U.S. missile placements, or U.S. missile defense systems, is anti-access or air denial platform for the U.S. to operate, in a sort of forward deployment, which is a direct sort of inhibition of Russian freedom to operate in that region. So they're not as much concerned about like the radar keeping track of what they're doing in Vladivostok, but they are more concerned with the general idea of a spread of anti-access air denial U.S. platforms against potential Russian action.
Is it okay if I add something about American views on this?
Yes.
So what DJ said was a very, very, and what everybody else added to was a very helpful understanding of the internal divisions in Korean opinion on this. But I can tell you, if you talk to most American policymakers on that question, they either don't know or don't care most about the internal divisions in the Korean Peninsula. And that actually, I think, highlights one of the American attitudes towards dealing with any players that are not quite as powerful as maybe a Russia or a China, is the kind of typical American hegemonic opinion on a lot of foreign policy decision making is well, ostensibly we support democracy, ostensibly we support national sovereignty, but if there's a security question, it's our way, that's what we're going to do. Now you do have probably all 5 people in Washington, D.C. who can tell you and sympathize with the things DJ was saying. But just because of the structure of the United States government, most of the people in Congress and most of the people in the presidency-appointed State Department and Defense Department are primarily concerned with a much more America-centric view of the Korean problem. And so they'll almost always take the kind of hawkish stance that the South Korean right does, as opposed to looking at the broader trends of South Korean opinion on that question. And that's not even to begin talking about North Korean opinion, to the extent that it exists.
I saw a quick question, a quick hand pop up here from the audience. Is that still alive? No? Alrighty.
So in this first section, we really saw sort of the comic that Soomin introduced really come alive in the sense that we're not really sure who's in the driver's seat when it comes to North Korean policy. This is important to keep in mind as we enter our second section when we discuss how to craft North Korean policy. We'll first start with Francis, then Rebecca, and then we'll open it up to the panel.
All right, so just as a start, I'll be discussing the U.S. Possible policy solutions. And before I begin, while I was trying to form an opinion and try to formulate a standpoint, it came to my mind that essentially when trying to find a U.S. Policy solution towards North Korea, there are no solutions which have no drawbacks. Almost every single policy solution that the US could possibly adopt has some certain drawback, whether political, economic, or just the cost of human life. So I'd like to divide it first up into what the US could do in the short term and policy solutions and certain policies that the US can adopt in the long term to ensure that stability continues, or well, stability is formed in the East Asia, and the possible tension or the possible catastrophic loss of life is minimized or does not hopefully happen at all whatsoever. So within the short term, one possible policy solution within this certain paradigm, within this certain lens, to ensure that there is some certain sense of peacefulness within the region is essentially that the US government should, especially President Trump, should avoid using such aggressive rhetoric. I'd like to share this phrase that I heard in the news called basically the soundbite of the century, which is a reference to President Trump's statements during his speech at the UN General Assembly. And essentially, Trump's aggressive comments regarding North Korea, they provide valuable material that the North Korean regime can use in order to further consolidate its power within North Korea through the forms of propaganda, and to further consolidate its opinion that the US is an aggressive state, and therefore North Korea's adoption of the use of nuclear weapons to defend itself is legitimate in that sense. So by avoiding aggressive rhetoric, that could be a first potential step within the short term that could be corrected to further alleviate the situation. Another possible policy solution could be establishing direct communication, some more bilateral cooperation. Within the past, there has been a lot of multilateral cooperation through, for example, like the six-party talks. There is some sort of historical precedence for the usage of establishing direct communication. For example, within the Cold War between the United States and the USSR, with the establishment of the Red Hotline, for example, as a means of direct communication between the two governments. And a third step in the short term would be to basically apply non-offensive methods of pressure in order to apply some certain sense of urgency to the situation that North Korea has to basically take action and try to correct its actions.
For sake of time, could you speed up your long-term one?
Yes, of course.
Thank
All right,
you.
so within the long term, essentially one step could be just continuing with steps to deter and contain North Korea. Full denuclearization of North Korea may not be possible in the long term. And so just simply deterring North Korea from further expanding its nuclear program somehow, or basically just accepting that North Korea, based on past examples with Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi, who have been accused of possessing WMDs, the US has to accept that from the North Korean perspective, its survival is contingent on having an established nuclear capability. And that's essentially what separates the Kim Jong-un's regime from these other states. And secondly, another step that the US should be prioritizing in the long term is preventing nuclear proliferation in East Asia. As it was mentioned earlier, there are some conservative factions within South Korea that may be considering having nuclear weapons. If the US cannot prove and reassure its allies that it will continue to protect its allies under its nuclear umbrella, then effectively this could persuade Japan and South Korea to develop their own nuclear weapons, starting an arms race in East Asia. And for the sake of stability, that is probably the worst way to go. So preventing nuclear proliferation is a must. And finally, a very important step is achieving China's support. What the United States hasn't necessarily done well is reassuring China's concerns in the future in the event of a collapse of the North Korean regime, such as the influx of refugees and the presence of a pro-US state right on China's borders. So a potential and very important long-term solution and goal that the US should be achieving is basically to reassure China or somehow persuade China and gain China's support.
Excellent. You brought up a lot of really good points.
Rebecca, will you speak on China's side?
Yes, I will first mention that I believe that this is first and foremost more worrying for the U.S. and more worrying for China. And so for the U.S., possible policy recommendations or possible actions, there mainly are around 4, I guess. First is like an all-out regime attack, as in you would send, U.S. forces to go and collapse the regime. But then this would also create like a vacuum, like a power vacuum, and U.S. would have to maintain power there for like a generation or 2. The next one would be like regime attack by, let's say, like by air. But then this would just kind of, how do I say this? Provoke the North Koreans and believe that they're, oh, this is an air attack and something else could happen. The next would be negotiations, and the fourth one would be waiting out. So I do believe that negotiations would be the best policy recommendations. I do believe that also, as I mentioned before, stability is the most important thing for the Chinese Communist Party. And I do believe that as of right now, it seems like stability is persuasive enough for the Chinese government to begin cooperation. And I also believe that because China wants to increase its soft power, increase its global responsibility, I do believe that all these forces are persuading China to begin just taking control, maybe not control, but taking influence of the Asia-Pacific region and begin cooperation with the United States. Because I do feel that China right now does feel very confident in basically becoming the Asia-Pacific hegemony in the next, say, like 20 years. Maybe you have something.
Yeah, just something that I want to highlight is like one of the major characteristics of Chinese foreign policy is that it focuses a lot on the long-term population benefit analysis instead of like the short-term like attention span. So to Chinese, their major goal is to like increase its power through a global perspective and then using a kind of like an incrementalism approach to build up its national image and then expand its national power. So I don't really think China would respond in the way that the U.S. wanted to if the U.S. increased to emphasize a lot on the military rhetoric and the aggressive rhetoric. I think China would like to see the regional from different countries and then it want to see like an international cooperation on solving this kind of non-proliferation issues. And I do want to add on to the point that China wants to seek the U.S. support on this issue, and the economic tie between China and U.S. is definitely really important in this issue.
Any other ending thoughts before we?
We may just have to wait and see if there is.
Yeah, I mean, well, actually, when you talk about U.S. stars, a good relevant point to think about as all the analysts in the IC did not see it coming. They expected it to happen sometime soon, but they didn't see when it would happen, and when it happened, it surprised a lot of people. So although most of the literature and most experts really discount the idea of just waiting for them to collapse in the next decade, it is something to think about as just a general thing. So that's basically our entire panel. So thank you guys so much for sitting through this. I hope you all learned a lot and have a good question to think about. And that's it for this panel. We're going to actually real quick at some advertisements. So my name is Jung-Soo Kim. I'm the academic vice president for Delta Phi Epsilon. We are the international relations professional fraternity on campus. We have about 70 or so people, adding people every semester. We started up last year, but we are a nationally recognized organization with chapters in UC Berkeley, in GW, in Georgetown. There are alumni brothers everywhere. We are co-educational. Feel free to join us. We'll have you again next semester.
And the proud partner and supporter of DP is a sister IR organization called Glimpse from the Globe, an IR publication that publishes online on glimpsefromtheglobe.com. We involve students from all disciplines to write articles regarding the globe, international affairs, different cultures. So please apply and, of course, read online. So in many ways, we examined from this panel how all of the strands of the United States, China, Russia, North Korea, South Korea, all form the Gordian knot of the 21st century. Will there be an Alexander among us to cut it? We don't know. We just have to study, discuss, and wait. Thank you.